They were alive for one reason. The Taliban needed the aircraft. It was their trophy. On the tarmac at Kandahar sat their captured IL-76TD, a Soviet 50-meter-long heavy transport aircraft. Its 7-man Russian crew were the only people there who knew how to keep it airworthy. After a year of stalled negotiations, it was clear no one was coming for them. If they were getting out, they would have to do it themselves. And hidden deep within the aircraft was their answer, one that could help them fly their 100-ton transport right into the most dangerous airspace in the world. Summer 1995. Afghanistan's civil war was a brutal game of territorial control, defined by who held the key geographic points, the countless checkpoints, and crucially, the air above each valley. Kandahar in the south was the undisputed heart of the Taliban. They'd taken the city in a lightning sweep in November 1994, surprising locals and foreign onlookers, and had quickly made it their administrative and spiritual hub. By mid-1995, they'd claimed huge parts of southern and western Afghanistan and were aggressively pushing toward Kabul. There, President Burhanuddin Rabbani's government, with the help of Ahmad Shah Massoud's forces, was desperately trying to hold the capital. In the conflict, an airfield with a functioning runway was a massive strategic prize, and the one at Kandahar was precisely that. The aircraft was an Ilyushin IL-76TD, registration RA-76842, chartered from Aristan, a small cargo operation based in Kazan, in the Russian Republic of Tatarstan. Aristan was one of dozens of companies that emerged after 1991, when Aeroflot dissolved from a single state airline into hundreds of regional carriers and charter outfits, many flying Soviet-era airframes into places that bigger operators had quietly crossed off their route maps. On August 3rd, RA-76842 was en route from Tirana, Albania, carrying ammunition bound for the Kabul government as part of a private deal between Albania and the Afghan Defense Ministry. Albania in 1995 was a post-communist state whose military warehouses held enormous quantities of Warsaw-packed weapons, poorly inventoried and loosely controlled, and it was a known source of arms for conflicts across the Balkans and beyond. A Taliban MiG-21 intercepted the IL-76 and forced it down at Kandahar airport. The 7-man Russian crew, Captain Vladimir Sharpatov, co-pilot Gazinur Khairulin, navigator Alexander Zidor, radio operator Yuri Vashivtsev, and flight engineers Ashkat Abyazov, Sergei Borisov, and Viktor Ryazantsev became hostages. A Russian Foreign Ministry envoy, when asked, insisted the flight did not violate international law. Russia's humiliation was immediate and public. A Moscow paper described the country smarting at the hands of guerrillas, with officials turning to the United Nations and Pakistan for help, while the Foreign Ministry got attacked for passivity. Tatarstan sent its own representatives to Kandahar and flew in food parcels, while publicly criticizing Moscow's failure to act. Sharpatov himself criticized his government's passivity in print. That a regional government inside Russia was running its own parallel hostage diplomacy said something pointed about how far Moscow's authority had frayed since 1991. The Russian Federation in 1995 was still digesting the political chaos of the 1993 constitutional crisis, fighting a war in Chechnya that had started in December 1994, and managing an economy in which GDP had fallen roughly 40% since 1990. Projecting state power on behalf of 7 cargo crew members, held by a militia in southern Afghanistan, was not something the Kremlin was structurally capable of doing. The Taliban's demands reached back into Soviet history. An official Russian statement of non-interference, and the return of thousands of Afghans allegedly imprisoned or taken to the Soviet Union during the 1979-89 war. A Russian envoy dismissed that as fantasy. It kept the crew in limbo. As for the aircraft, NATO called it Candid, a good name for a machine of such conspicuous size. The IL-76 first flew in 1971 and entered production in the mid-1970s, designed under G.V. Novozhilov at the Ilyushin Design Bureau. It's a Soviet military transport built to lift heavy payloads, fitted with overhead cranes and a rear ramp that can also serve as a hoist. Rarely did military variants carry guns and a rear turret, a reminder that Soviet planners expected their transports to operate in hostile airspace. Over 900 IL-76s were produced at the Tashkent Aviation Production Association plant in Uzbekistan before production transferred to Russia, making it one of the most widely built heavy transports in history. By the mid-1990s, IL-76s were operating on every continent, flown by military forces, state airlines, and private cargo operators that fill the gaps in official logistics networks. The airframe silhouette tells you exactly what it cares about. High wing layout keeps the four Soloviev D30KP turbofan engines, each producing roughly 12,000 kilograms force of thrust, fitted with clamshell-type thrust reversers, away from ground debris. The D30KP, manufactured by Aviation in Perm, with a bypass ratio of approximately 2.36 to 1, was also used on the Tu-154M airliner, meaning Soviet maintenance infrastructure across the entire country was already built around keeping it running. A T-tail keeps the horizontal stabilizer clear of the cargo ramp's airflow. The nose gear carries 4 wheels. Each of the 2 main gear units on each side runs a 4-wheel bogie, 20 wheels in total, designed to distribute the aircraft's 190-ton maximum takeoff weight across surfaces no Western airport planner ever approved. The wing spans approximately 50.5 meters and sits high enough that light ground vehicles can pass underneath it, a practical consideration on the kind of improvised strips the aircraft was built to use. The cargo hold measures approximately 24.5 meters long, 3.46 meters wide, and 3.4 meters high, with a maximum payload of 50 tons. The aircraft carries its own handling infrastructure, overhead hoists, winches, a roller bed system, and a rear ramp for roll-on, roll-off loading. Soviet planners did not assume the destination would provide anything useful, so they built the useful things into the airframe. The IL-76TD is a long-range derivative with increased fuel capacity, a range of roughly 3,650 kilometers at full payload, a maximum speed of around 850 kilometers per hour, and a service ceiling of around 15,500 meters. Those numbers matter in the context of Kandahar, 1996. But the absolute most critical feature for the hostage crew is far less dramatic. The auxiliary power unit, a turbine mounted in the left landing gear sponson, provides the electrical power and pneumatic pressure the D30KP engines need to start. No ground power unit, no external air cart. If the APU runs, the aircraft can wake itself up entirely from its own internal systems. That single design choice sealed the fate of the spectacular series of events about to unfold. By November 1995, the basic facts were already in print. Taliban forces were holding 7 Russian crew members hostage in Kandahar, months after the August interception. Taliban's framing focused on the cargo and its destination, ammunition for Afghan government forces, in a war where those forces were the enemy. A U.S. newspaper account states Taliban forces also alleged the Afghan government itself had chartered the aircraft. To understand why the Taliban had a MiG-21 available to intercept an incoming transport, it helps to know that they'd captured substantial quantities of Afghan Air Force equipment left over from the Soviet-backed government that collapsed in 1992. The Afghan Air Force at its Cold War peak had operated over 400 aircraft. By 1995, much of that inventory was distributed among the various factions, with the Taliban controlling a portion of the fixed-wing fleet at Kandahar. They were not a conventional air force, but they controlled enough runways and airframes to enforce airspace over their territory against aircraft they chose to challenge. The IL-76 was valuable on multiple levels at once. As a functioning aircraft with a 50-ton payload capacity that could operate from rough fields, it was worth more to a militia managing supply logistics than almost anything else that could land in Kandahar. As leverage, it gave the Taliban a Russian problem at a moment when Russia could not afford to look helpless. And parked visibly on Kandahar's ramp, it was a captured Russian aircraft under Taliban control, communicating something to the outside world that verbal claims of strength could not. Deseret News reported that the crew spent the first weeks confined to the aircraft itself before being moved to a house in Kandahar. From the outside, the incident became a diplomatic knot with no obvious loose ends. The Moscow Times described Russia as having limited influence in a country it had spent roughly a decade and between 15,000 and 26,000 military lives trying to shape before withdrawing in February 1989. The government that replaced the Soviet client state had itself collapsed by 1992 into the factorial civil war still burning in 1995. The foreign ministry was caught between demands it couldn't meet and military options it didn't have. The Taliban wanted acknowledgement of Soviet-era crimes that Moscow had no interest in acknowledging. That gap kept the negotiation permanently stalled, and 7 men paid for it, one day at a time. Aviation Zerotrans, which later published a retrospective titled 378 Days in Kandahar, describes what those days felt like. Water shortages, illness, and the particular psychological pressure of captivity with no visible end date. The crew was held through an Afghan summer. Kandahar runs above 40 degrees Celsius for months, and through the following winter. By multiple accounts, Captain Sharpatov himself was the crew's anchor. He maintained discipline, kept morale high, and came up with a possible escape plan. The 7 men were not strangers. They knew and trusted each other, and they were bound by a tried and tested hierarchy. Sharpatov used that structure deliberately across all 378 days. The Taliban was gaining ground, and the situation was growing less and less favorable for the hostages. The crew spent their captivity watching the political situation around them deteriorate, not stabilize. By February 1996, the UN Security Council's Afghanistan deliberations included a specific line urging the captors of the Russian aircraft crew to release them immediately and without preconditions. The resolution, SC-6177, was a secondary line in a broader statement on Afghanistan, rather than a dedicated hostage document, which itself indicates how the crew's situation ranked within the international community's hierarchy of Afghan problems. It changed nothing. The Tatarstan government's parallel diplomacy ran throughout the captivity. Intimur Shamiev, then president of Tatarstan, repeatedly pushed Moscow for more aggressive action, and Tatarstan's representatives visited Kandahar independently of the Russian Foreign Ministry delegation. All 7 crew members were from Tatarstan. This was not abstract advocacy. U.S. Senator Hank Brown met with Taliban leadership, who told him the Russians would remain captive until Afghans allegedly detained in Russia were released. However, no names for those alleged detainees were ever provided. It was like the Taliban negotiated just for show, not to find true common ground that could lead to an authentic prisoner exchange operation. Meanwhile, the crew had been persuading the guards for months to allow regular maintenance visits to the aircraft. The argument was both practical and true. An IL-76TD left unattended on a sun-baked ramp develops hydraulic seal failures, fuel system contamination, and avionics degradation that eventually make it worthless. The Taliban's financial interest in the aircraft not rotting was the only opening in the wall. As the time ticked on, the Taliban agreed, and the hostages were able to work on their only means of escape. How do you hide a jailbreak in plain sight? You make it look exactly like chores. The guards stood by with rifles, while mechanics crawled into the wheel wells with grease guns and heavy wrenches. They watched sweating men working over metal joints and assumed they were staring at pure boredom. They missed the actual target entirely. The Russians ignored almost the entire airplane. They focused all their quiet desperation on one specific auxiliary turbine. It sat buried deep in the left landing gear sponson. You cannot start a beast like a D30 KP turbofan engine by simply turning a key. Electrical power does almost nothing to those massive internal blades. A modern jet engine demands a violent blast of compressed air to spin the central core up to ignition speed. Civilian airports use heavy ground carts to push that air. Many other types of large aircraft use the aforementioned APU, a small independent engine that provides electrical power and compressed air to operate systems and start the main engines. They needed to get the APU back in working order. It was their ticket out. That little hidden turbine generated that exact blast of air. Keeping it alive meant preserving their only physical exit strategy. They babied the auxiliary power unit for months. They wiped down the pressurized lines. They checked the fluid levels, all while disguising their preparations for escape as routine mechanical hygiene. 7 men bet their entire existence on a tiny auxiliary motor hidden in the belly of a stranded giant. A guard staring up into a cramped gear bay has zero context for what makes a massive plane fly, and that was exactly why the scheme was working. Under the punishing sun, the crew mentally mapped out the psychological rhythms of their captors. They noticed exactly when the guards grew tired. They tracked the daily prayer schedules. They realized the Taliban commanders hated standing out in the midday heat. They weaponized that fatigue. They smiled and wiped grease on their heavy coveralls. They went back to their cells. They waited for the perfect alignment of extreme luck and utter indifference. Friday rolled around on August 16th, 1996. Captain Sharpatov saw the exact fracture in the routine they needed. The afternoon prayer call dragged most of the heavy security detail away from the flight line. The Russians walked out to the metal behemoth under the usual pretense of upkeep. They climbed into the greenhouse cockpit with their armed escort. They hit the sequence to wake the auxiliary turbine. They initiated the main start sequence. Nothing happened. The fan blades sat perfectly still. They tried again, with zero success. The engine refused to catch on the third attempt. Sweat flooded the claustrophobic flight deck. The Taliban commanders, watching them from the dirt, decided staring at a dead airplane was a monumental waste of time. They walked away. They left 3 bored junior guards to watch the mechanics fail. That specific procedural gap handed the crew the world. The commanders assumed a jet failing 3 times meant the engine was dead. They guessed wrong. The moment the commanders disappeared from view, the crew physically attacked the remaining guards inside the cabin. They tied them up with whatever they had. The tiny turbine finally screamed to life on the 4th try. It blasted compressed air into the first main engine until the massive fan blade spun up and caught fire. That first screaming engine then bled its own pressurized air across the internal plumbing. The hot manifold woke up the other 3. The startup ran purely automatically from there. 48,000 kilograms of thrust kicked in. Flight engineer Viktor Ryazanov later told reporters he just wanted to see his family and his dog. The throttles went full forward. The jet surged down the 3,000-meter paved strip. Alarmed soldiers rushed vehicles onto the concrete to block the massive airplane. A huge fire truck was hurried into position in a desperate attempt to block the aircraft from taking off. The Russian crew held the nose down. An aircraft engineered for ruined Siberian runways and debris strikes rolled on 20 massive wheels attached to heavy bogies. They carried absolutely zero cargo. They held the bare minimum fuel required for a short, frantic sprint across the border to Sharjah. The jet weighed less than half of its maximum design limit. The enormous landing gear rolled straight over the blockade at the very end of the runway. The enormous wings finally bit hard into the thick Afghan heat. They lifted off the deck. The crew kept the IL-76 at a low altitude of approximately 100 meters. According to the Independent, the aircraft flew out barely above rooftop height. This low altitude is corroborated by Aviacon's report, which also states the crew disabled radio navigation aids to prevent the Taliban from tracking their signal. Civilian navigation aids broadcast continuously and can be used for rough triangulation by anyone with the right receiver. Turning them off removes that signature at the cost of precision navigation over unfamiliar terrain. The route to Sharjah runs approximately 1,100 kilometers across Iranian and Pakistani airspace. Neither country received notification. Pakistan's airspace authority later confirmed the aircraft transited without clearance. At 100 meters over terrain that includes the mountains of the Afghan-Pakistani border region, in a heavy transport running without navigation aids, the margin for error is narrow enough that difficult undersells it considerably. Khairulin, in the right seat, had been a co-pilot on IL-76s long enough to know what the aircraft felt like at the edge of its performance. What the crew flew that afternoon was not textbook airmanship. It was the accumulated experience of professional aviators doing something well outside the manual and getting it right. A Taliban spokesman, quoted by the Independent, confirmed the Taliban aircraft attempted pursuit but could not catch the IL-76. The Taliban's air assets in August 1996 were Soviet-era fighters captured from the Afghan Air Force and maintained under field conditions with limited spare parts. With 48,000 kgf of combined thrust and a cruise speed approaching 800 kilometers per hour, a cleanly configured IL-76 with a head start is not something that force could run down. The destination was Sharjah in the UAE, which had already become a major cargo hub in the Gulf and was home to numerous Russian and CIS-registered operators who'd set up shop there after 1991. For post-Soviet crews, Sharjah's ramp was familiar territory. Its political neutrality and proximity to Dubai's diplomatic infrastructure made it the perfect final stop. The crew arrived with 3 of their former guards on board, taken during the overpowering to prevent immediate coordination of pursuit. UAE police questioned and released the Russians. Taliban guards remained in custody. By presidential decree, dated August 22, 1996, 6 days after the escape, Sharpadov received the title Hero of the Russian Federation. Khairulin received the same. The remaining 5 crew members received the Order of Courage. A biographical page from Kazan National Research Technical University records the decree and Sharpadov's subsequent career. The 2010 Russian film Kandahar, based on his diary and made with his involvement as a consultant, pulled the escape into post-Soviet mythology, specifically the mythology of competence operating without institutional support, which resonated in a Russia where the state had largely stopped providing that support. 7 men from Tatarstan had done what the Kremlin could not, using an aircraft the Kremlin no longer owned, and the country made a hero of the captain. The Il-76's history in Afghanistan predates 1995 by nearly 2 decades. During the Soviet intervention beginning in December 1979, Il-76 freighters were part of the initial airlift that put Soviet troops on the ground in Kabul within 72 hours of the operation's authorization. The 103rd Guards Airborne Division flew into Kabul Airport on December 25 and 26, 1979, aboard Il-76s and AN-22s, one of the largest airborne operations the Soviet Union had conducted since World War II. A Royal Air Force air power study describes the air bridge role those fleets played over the subsequent decade and the protective measures that became routine: helicopter escorts dispensing flares over Kabul, and steep, spiraling approaches designed to minimize time within the missile threat envelope. Soviet transport crews developed high-angle instrument descents directly over the runway threshold to reduce exposure to ground fire during the most vulnerable phase of flight. These procedures were not theoretical. They were worked out in the field, adjusted after losses, and passed between crews as hard-earned knowledge. The FIM-92A Stinger arrived in the hands of Afghan fighters in September 1986, supplied by the United States. Its all-aspect engagement capability changed the threat geometry entirely. Compared to the Strela 2's rear aspect-only envelope, and forced immediate changes. Higher transit altitudes, accelerated countermeasure programs, and additional flare dispensers retrofitted to airframes already in theater. The Il-76 was not invulnerable. Aviation Safety Network records a Soviet Air Force Il-76M, registration CCCP-86739, shot down on October 27, 1984, near Kabul, by a shoulder-fired Strela that struck the wing between engines 1 and 2. Loss of control, crash, fatalities. Aviation history sources report approximately 14,700 Il-76 flights during the Soviet intervention, moving around 786,200 servicemen and 315,800 tons of freight. Widely cited estimates, rather than the verified ledger, but indicative of a decade of sustained exposure in a contested environment. The aircraft that Sharpadov flew out of Kandahar in August 1996 was a direct descendant in design and in doctrine of the aircraft that had been running that air bridge since 1979, absorbing losses and continuing to fly. In 1996, Sharpadov and his crew were activating something built into the aluminum across those same decades. Assume the ground is hostile, the runway is imperfect, the support equipment is gone, and the mission still has to happen. On one Friday afternoon in August, after 378 days of patience and planning, and a year of watching their country fail to reach them, that assumption lifted into the sky and held.